Hi, I'm Marco Pecorari and I'm the Program Director of the MA in Fashion Studies of the new school Parsons Paris.
So hello, I'm Myrna Arsalus and I'm Director of Palais Galliera, the Fashion Museum of the City of Paris.
Well, hi, I'm Laurent Cotin. I'm both in charge of the graphic department of Palais Galliera, and I'm also the professor of curating fashion at Parsons Paris.
The Master in Fashion Studies is a two-year program where students develop knowledge about the history of fashion, but also different critical perspective looking at fashion on a broader sense. And we look at fashion on the production of fashion, the representation of fashion, and the consumption of fashion. A particular attention for the master is a focus on fashion curating. And this is why, and the reason why we develop a collaboration with Palais Galliera, in particular starting with the work of Laurent Cotin as a teacher of the course Curating Fashion, and also with the collaboration with the director Myrna Arsalus for both the creation of masterclasses that expose our students to the experience of Myrna, in this case, around curating in different environments. This is the context in which we develop this project, and for us it's very interesting to also see the perspective of a museum curator, also to expose students to people who actually work in the spaces of museum and work on a daily basis with both the creative aspect of curating, but also the constraints that curating may have today. So Myrna, would you mind tell us a bit more about why it could be interesting for you and for the institution to collaborate with an academic institution like us?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting in different ways. On the one hand, that is part of our mission. I mean, we are the Fashion Museum of the City of Paris. It's a public museum. It's part of our mission to let people access our collections, and we have also a pedagogic mission. To work with the students and to make the most out of a collection, to make them discover the collection, and to also provoke new thinking around fashion, to enable experiences through our collection. I mean, that is part of what we do, and a very essential part of what we do, or why we're there. But it's also very good for us, and we talked a lot about it with Laurent, because it makes us, I mean, we are in this very particular moment in the history of our museum where we are presenting for the first time in its long history a permanent collection, an exhibition through our collection, and in this case a history of fashion through the Galliera collection. So we are ourselves thinking out of the box about how to interpret objects differently from what we have maybe done in the last years. So, this experience, this collaborative experience is a shared experience that we have through Laurent with the students, and that make us think differently and look at our own objects differently through this experience. So it's a very enriching collaborative project, I feel.
I really do agree with you, because I think it's very inspiring to have the fresh point of view of the students on our collections. And well, we're accustomed to those collections. Well, so somehow, let's say, for us, it's absolutely everyday life, but which was great, and especially during this year or last year, let's say, with this group of students. Was there an enthusiasm about that? Maybe it was due to the lockdown, to the particular situation during the crisis, but maybe they were more enthusiastic about that, about discovering things, about creating something, creating a project and a performance in the end of the school year. And I think it's always very inspiring, and I think you think the same, because, well, you just, oh yeah, that's a very clever point of view, and well, we should reuse that in our curating work, by the way, without stealing their ideas, of course. But no, but it's a permanent exchange with the museum and the students. And this year it was very interesting as well, in my opinion, because we were working on the theme of object and troubles. And that's true that our discipline is not exactly ethical, because fashion is not ethical per se. Let's say it's more exclusive than inclusive, it's polluting, it's absolutely everything you can imagine. And trying to reform fashion to something more positive and more progressive is a little like, I don't know, turning a tiger into a herbivore, but we can try, we can try. It's always possible to strive maybe to do something like that, but our idea this year and our aim was to study objects with all the issues there which are inherent to the objects, to their creation, to the previous owners, to the previous creator, in all honesty, and presenting things with a distance, with a critical mind, which is very important to me. Maybe too important to me sometimes, but being always honest and giving information and giving the audience the freedom of thinking by themselves and not preaching, never. Well, that's about my point of view.
So this year, in fact, we decided to, I mean, every year we work with a different topic, and I remember when we met, which was almost a year ago, when we started thinking, what can we look at? And I think a big part of the fashion studies program, but also of your attention in the museum, is to start thinking, as you said, outside the box and rethinking about new ways to narrate stories about what you have in the collection. And so I remember when we were discussing we were also looking at what was happening outside, and all this question about rethinking and decolonizing the museum, and looking at different new ways to build narratives around museum and fashion. Museum often are the result of some Western canons, or even most of the time, as Laurent was saying, sometimes are also evidence of aspect of privilege. But rather than having a sort of destructive or negative way of looking at this collection, was actually trying to use them as an opportunity actually to show the potential of this collection, and from a critical point of view. That's when the idea of and the title comes from, this idea of object in trouble, aims to speak about the current time in which we live, and where, in an important and good way, a lot of discussion is happening around Western canons and fashion history, but at the same time try to see the potential on that side. And I again, when we were discussing, I remember we start thinking what object, and Laurent, you kind of put together also a list of objects. Maybe you could say, what were you thinking when you were?
We selected with the students. Well, in fact, they had a choice. They had a choice in the beginning between, I think, something like a tenth of objects, and finally they chose, and I was very glad of their choice, I must admit, one empire dress made in cotton, well, which is very, very problematic according to the history of cotton, which is but just about colonialism, slavery, and absolutely everything, and restriction in terms of hues in France during the Napoleonic Wars. A dress worn by the Duchess of Windsor, designed by Dior, which is about also the supremacy of Parisian culture in haute couture in the 50s. Another interesting case of appropriation with the Manchu, with an imperial Manchu coat worn as a tea gown by Princess Murat in the beginning of the 20th century, and a book which is rather misogynist but very funny at the same time, which is Le Vrai et le Faux Chic by Sam, and which is also about the very Parisian standards of what to do and what not to do with being in and out, and so we thought it was very rich in terms of things, and they developed many good ideas, especially with little videos with their presentation, in my opinion, once again, but. No, it was very invigorating this year, all the thing they found and all the questions they've asked with that, and I think that's the most important point in this type of work. Is all the questions you raised. Well, our point is not to give solutions or give a dogma or something like that, but well, it's more about questions.
Yeah, for us, it ends up being a sort of a very intense brainstorming about our own collection. You know, as we work, you know, on the selection of objects with Laurent, on the questions that we think we can address through these objects, and then in the work that Laurent does with the students themselves, is a sort of it shakes us, you know, to have the vision of things. It's very refreshing. And it makes us feel more connected than ever. Of course, we are confronted to our visitors in a regular basis, but it's a more distant sort of relationship, and it's not always easy to have their feedback or, you know, to understand what they're thinking or their reactions. But in this work that we're doing together, we have this, you know, extremely intelligent and critical sort of a group of young students that also make us, you know, question things about the way maybe that we have looking at things until now. So it's a very direct and immediate way of connecting to contemporary issues that, you know, worry and interest our potential public and visitors. So
I think another aspect that for us is always very interesting also because at the end is a course. So students are actually, I mean, it's not just producing an exhibition, a performance, but is also learning by doing it, which for us is also a way in which we try to innovate to some extent in pedagogy around, in this case, creating fashion, but fashion at large. I think another way also with having Laurent as a teacher, but also you coming to do some master classes for our students, we tried also to expose them to a bit of a bureaucratic limitation of the
reality of our job.
Do you think that this type of what do you think about this aspect, and could these opportunities also a way to escape your everyday life, but at the same time also rethink the role of these everyday activities that you do in the museum as a way to construct meaning about fashion history?
No, I think it's, I mean, on the one hand, it's a very sort of immediate, practical sort of reason why we should do this is for them to really understand what we do in museums, because there's always this risk, especially when you do fashion, because everything that fashion is touched by fashion seems to be cooler and, you know, sort of more dreamy and more beautiful, but we are finally, and after all, a museum that manages a collection that makes the same questions and has the same mission as a lot of other public museums in the world. So it is interesting that they are confronted to the reality of what it is our work and how difficult it is sometimes and how limited we are sometimes in the work we do and the decisions we take by, you know, all sorts of considerations from, you know, budget to other types of political considerations that we have to take into account being a public museum and a municipal museum as we are, for example. So it's good that they are sort of, you know, they have this very down-to-earth experience of what we do in museums from, you know, they also, because with you, they go through also all the process of...
Yeah, even inventory, which is not necessarily my passion, as you know, but which is very interesting, because there's a sort of symbolical part in inventory, and especially with our inventory books. And after a while, when you focus on that and you have to study and to teach about that, well, you realize that there's something rather interesting in those books, in their particular position in the museum, because they are the first thing to be saved in case of fire or anything. And they are finally our tables of the law in the museum. After a while, I realized, well, finally, it's something much more important and much more interesting that what I realize in everyday life, you know, writing.
So maybe you reconcile yourself with this
Absolutely.
part of your job.
Yeah. That's a conversion.
It's therapy.
It's therapy.
Yeah.
But I think also you at the beginning were speaking about this collaborative aspect, and it's something that I want also to stress out. These projects are always collaborative between Laurent, of course, that is the teacher of the class, but then there is also Justin Morin, who is another professor at the school, who collaborates especially for these ways of translating ideas, because for us it's also very important again to to make aware our students of the bureaucratic element about the everyday life, work in a museum, also to learn how to be critical, because sometimes, I think often in public media, we see criticism towards the planning or what museums are presenting without actually knowing and filtering that critique with the everyday life that you curators have to deal with. So for us also this aspect of asking our students to transform their ideas into an exhibition, or like in this case a performance, it's important, but it's also the result of a collaborative work. Another important element, of course, is the participation also of Antoine Boucher and the work that he does with Nicolas Montagne at Dictat, that they're always very generous also with our students to participate both to a feedback that we give with Laurent, but also to implement and show students new ways to present. And of course, from 2 years also we have a perspective of our colleague like Morna Lang, who develop with me the more traditional academic part, but I think this relation between theory and practice, it's already a place with our collaboration, but we also try to embed it in the program itself. That the performance then aims to propose also a more performative way to look at theory and the way in which theory can be presented to a larger public. That for us is also an important element, not to keep this field of fashion studies only as an output in books or conferences, but also use the performance as a tool to express different concerns and different views on fashion history.
This is sort of a curation as well at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So with the result of everything that they've been looking at, the curating through a performance, the result of this project is extremely enriching and interesting.
And in terms of curating process, well, I've noticed, and I thought that was extremely interesting, was the evolution of ideas in any project. By the way, from the first idea that they got in front of a piece, which sometimes it's very striking visually, and the developing of the ideas to finally aim to something which was, well, not completely different, but much more subtle in the end.
So I would like to thank again both Mylène and Laurent for the great opportunity and for taking the time also from your busy schedule also to work with our students.
Well, I think we are extremely happy with the result. It's been, as I was saying before, enriching and fascinating journey for us as well. And we would like to, I don't know if you want to thank your students.
Oh yeah, of course. I would like to thank my students, but I did it already several times, I think. But no, I really would like to thank Justin and Antoine and Morna at the same time, and especially Antoine, because he's extremely generous with all the documents, well, very precious documents. Well, he doesn't give, but he gives the student the opportunity to see them directly, and well, that's great for that.
Yeah, and also congratulations for to the students for the amazing work that they have done and the amazing performances that they have, staged, and it's really very impressive the work they've done both intellectually and also as curators. So congratulations, and we're very excited to continue doing things like this with you.
Thanks.